This lecture will cover information on memory. Here are 4 terms that I'd like for you to be familiar with. Memory. This is our ability to retain information over time. Encoding. This is how we make meaning of information that we're taking in, and we'll elaborate on this some more during the lecture. Storing. This is the process of placing encoded information into a mental storage space. So if we're looking at long-term memory, then this is relatively permanent storage. And then we use that information later on and recall it for whatever purpose, whether it's to do a task that we've done before in the past, or to do things like answer a question on an exam. Retrieving is this process of recalling information. So we pull information from either our short-term or long-term memory so that we can use that stored information in the present moment. So there are 3 types of memory that I'd like for you to be familiar with. That is sensory memory, short-term or working memory, and long-term. With regard to sensory memory, this is information that we take in through the senses. And from there, if we focus or pay attention to that information, it will actually go into working or short-term memory. If we choose to encode that information, make meaning of it in some way, then it gets stored into long-term memory for more permanent storage. And then you'll see the image below. This is an overview of how information goes through the 3 different types of memory. Notice at the very top, from external events, there is an arrow and it points directly to long-term memory. And this is just representing when we unconsciously put things into long-term. And we'll talk a bit more about that on the following slides. In the meantime, keep this process in mind. So sensory memory. This is where information initially goes. There are 2 types, iconic and echoic. What I'd like for you to think about is, how do we take in icons on a screen? We take that in through our eyes. So this is sensory information that's visual. What sense do we use to take in echoes? Our hearing. So this is sensory information that is processed auditorily. What I'd like for you to bear in mind is sensory memory, things go into that automatically. We don't have to process it. It's involuntary. It holds that information just a couple seconds until we figure out what to do next. So let me give you an example of how sensory memory helps us out. When you're driving, what kind of visual information stimuli is there? People walking around, on the sidewalk, other cars on the road, traffic signs, traffic lights. For me, I'd get distracted by cute little dogs. These are all things that your sensory memory is taking in at the same time, holding everything there just for a couple seconds till you figure out what you need to do next. Now, of all those things, what's the most important stimulus to pay attention to? Likely the other cars on the road, especially if there's one stopping right in front of you. So this is iconic memory, just taking in automatically all those visual stimuli that you're exposed to, holding it just a couple seconds for you to make a decision. Echoic memory. Maybe you've done something like this. You're having a conversation with someone, you're listening to a lecture, you're at a training or workshop of some sort. For a moment you get distracted, or maybe you're trying to vigorously write down your notes or type up your notes. And then all of a sudden you think, oh my gosh, what did they just say? And it's almost as if there's a recording playing in your head repeating what was just said. This is echoic memory helping you out. It's automatically recording just 2 or 3 seconds of auditory information for you. Sensory memory is really important because it helps us with 3 different functions. 1, it prevents us from getting overwhelmed. It takes in sensory information automatically so we don't have to give it any effort. So it helps save energy. The second is it gives us decision-making time. Why? Because it's holding that information just for a couple seconds for us to make a split-second decision. And then the third is it provides stability, playback, and recognition. So as I mentioned with echoic memory, It allows me to rewind the information that I was just exposed to. Same thing with iconic memory. If you think about stopping behind the car that's in front of you, but you also remember that there was a dog walking on the sidewalk and you're not sure if they had a person holding them on a leash. So what you'll first do is stop behind the car in front of you and then go back to, oh, I remember seeing a dog and I'm wondering if it was on leash because I want to make sure it doesn't go into traffic. So that iconic memory holds that visual information for you to make a decision and plan on what needs to occur next. Next is short-term memory or working. How does information go from sensory memory to short-term? Well, what we need to do is decide that information is important enough so that we start to pay attention to it. So I don't know if you've ever done this. You meet somebody and they're introduced to you by name, and a moment later you forget their name. But if someone says, oh, this person's going to be a new coworker here in our office, then I go, oh, that's an important person for me to remember. And so I make sure that I pass on that information to short-term or working memory. So in short-term or working memory, we can hold an average of 7 items plus or minus 2 for about 2 to 30 seconds. The thing to keep in mind about short-term memory is it has a limited duration. We can only hold that information there for so long. And a way that we can extend that duration is through maintenance rehearsal, which is a fancy term for repetition. So going back to that example that I just mentioned of meeting someone and learning their name for the first time, what I might want to do is just repeat their name in my head until I type it fully on my phone or jot it down on a Post-it when I get back to my desk. We can repeat that information over and over again in our heads to hold it in short-term or working memory. Another version of maintenance rehearsal is flashcards, whether they're virtual or physical flashcards that you make. I know students sometimes they'll use that as a form of repetition, repeating the information over and over again until it finally sticks. As I mentioned previously, short-term memory also has limited capacity. If we try to hold too much information in short-term, what happens is interference. We can hold a range of 5 to 9 items on average. If we try to shove too much information into short term, then whatever's already in there gets pushed out. And if we haven't encoded it sufficiently, it will not make its way to long-term memory. So if you think about procrastinating for an exam, since we're rushing and prepping for that test, we're trying to shove everything in there. We're not able to give enough time to really discern whether or not that information is truly critical for the exam. So if I've already capped out at 9 items and I try to shove a 10th item in there, guess what? Item number 1 gets pushed out. If I add item number 11 in there, then number 2 gets pushed out. And again, if encoding hasn't happened sufficiently, it will not make its way into long-term memory. One way that we can try to expand this limited capacity in short-term memory is through chunking. And what that means is we take larger bits of information and squeeze it into one small bit. One way that we do this is through songs. If you've ever heard the ABC song in elementary school and learned it at that time, that is one chunk. And the way you know that you're chunking is because oftentimes for you to figure out what letter comes before the next is you sing it really quickly in your head. If you're like me and you learn the song that lists all the states in alphabetical order in the United States, then you also engage in chunking if you sing that song in your head to get to where that state is on the list. You might also do this through things like acronyms. There's a lot of those in math, for instance, or any other acronym you might have created or learned from a teacher to help you memorize information. So what are the 3 functions of short-term or working memory? That is attending, rehearsing, and storing. Attending. So the reason that we call short-term memory working memory is because in order for us to keep it in short-term memory, we must focus on it. We must pay attention to it. We must be actively working with that information. We also can engage in rehearsing. during short-term memory. Rehearsing. Short-term memory also gives us time, as I mentioned, 2 to 30 seconds, to keep information in short term, maybe through things like maintenance rehearsal, so that we can figure out what we need to do next. Short-term memory information doesn't always intentionally need to make its way to long-term memory. Sometimes we're just holding information there long enough so that we can write it down, put it in our phone, whatever the case may be, and then we can let it go. So maybe you run into someone you haven't seen in a really long time and you no longer have their phone number in your cell phone. What you do is, as they're giving you the numbers, you're repeating them in your head so that you just have enough time to hold it there to then put it into your phone, and then you can release that information. You don't have to memorize it, right? It's already going to get held for you on your device. So that's an example where we just want information to go in a short term, but we don't need to have it go to long term. Storing. This is where we store away information through the process of encoding and make its way to long-term memory if that's the goal. To the right of the bullet points is an image here. It's a graph. And it's showing you that if you revisit information that you're learning every single day, what happens is it takes less and less time for you to recall the information. So the more you rehearse, the less time it takes for you to relearn that information or recall that information. This is related to the concept of spacing effect. We retain information more effectively when we rehearse it over time. What research shows us is procrastination is not the most effective. In fact, it's very ineffective at helping us learn. What's more effective is relearning or revisiting information over time. Next, let's look at long-term memory. So let's look at long-term memory. This is where we hold information for long periods of time, and there's the potential for unlimited amounts of information so long as our memory remains intact. In order for information to go from short-term or working memory into long-term, as mentioned, it has to be encoded. And that's what this slide is really going to primarily cover. We can engage in a couple different types of rehearsal. One is the maintenance rehearsal that we covered already. As a reminder, this is repetition, just saying or writing or reading that information over and over and over again. The next one is elaborative rehearsal. And this is when we make associations between new information that we're taking in and old information that we already have stored away. So I remember my very first class that I taught years ago, over 20 years ago, and there was a young man and his name was Austin. I remembered his name after that first class. Why? Because someone important in my life had the last name Austin. Even though it was his first name, the connection was already made. It already reminded me of our friend. So you might have made connections in classes between information that you knew already and something that you're taking in. This is one of the reasons why I do ask you sometimes to make a connection or think of an example in your personal life that's related to a concept that we're covering in class. It's a very powerful way to make an association between something that you're learning that's new and then connecting it to something that you already know, a memory or an experience that you've had previously. There are types of encoding as well. One is automatic encoding, and that is those things that you don't have to give effort to. It automatically gets stored away into long-term memory. These would be personal events, things that are meaningful to you, things that you find interesting, or even skills and habits, like brushing your teeth and getting ready for bed. Think about this. What's your favorite movie? What's your favorite meal? Where did you go the last time you went on vacation or had a day off? Where is the farthest place you've ever traveled to away from home? These are the kind of things that would get stored away automatically because these are personally relevant events in your life. But maybe you're a movie buff, or maybe you like comics, or maybe you're into cars. Think of something that you're really interested in, like sports, perhaps. Those bits of information that are related to areas of interest for you oftentimes also get automatically encoded. Effortful encoding. This is the opposite. Here is where we actually have to give effort and time and consciousness to store this information away. A lot of this could be things like school learning, or maybe subjects that are harder for you to retain and understand, or maybe subjects that you don't find to be as interesting. But this is where we have to give it effort. So you see in the image to the right, on the left side is automatic encoding. This person is eating spaghetti. And so they're probably going to be able to remember that they ate spaghetti for that meal. They don't have to repeat it in their head. I ate spaghetti, I ate spaghetti, I ate spaghetti. This is an automatic encoding example. And then to the right, you see this other person reading a book with some Starbucks on the desk, and they're giving effort to what they're taking in so that they can encode that into long-term memory. Additional types of encoding are visual, acoustic, and semantic. With visual, you're looking at visual information. You're just paying attention to how something looks. Acoustic, you're just encoding auditory information. You're just paying attention to what that information sounds like. And then semantic encoding is where you're actually paying attention to what that term means. So you're understanding what it is and how to use that information, how to apply it. So what I'd like for you to think about is levels of processing. Let's first look at the top cluster of bullet points, types of rehearsal. If you had to guess, which do you think results in a deeper level of processing? Maintenance rehearsal or elaborative? If you're thinking elaborative, you're correct, because information that's new is now being connected to something that you already have stored away in long-term memory, something already meaningful to you. How about levels of processing between types of encoding? Do you think we have an easier time hanging on or recalling things that are encoded automatically or effortfully? A lot of times, the things that we store away automatically are the ones that we retain and can recall more easily. And then there's visual, acoustic, and semantic encoding. Which one do you think results in a deeper level of processing? Keep that question in mind as we go into the next slide. So here are some examples of encoding. Chair. Is the word in capital letters? No, it isn't. This is visual encoding because we're just paying attention to what the word chair looks like. 2. Does the word rhyme with train? And the word here is brain. The answer is yes, it does. Brain and train rhyme. This is an example of acoustic encoding. You're only paying attention to what it sounds like. And the third is, would the word fit in this sentence, the word being gun? The gun. The dog put the gun on the table. This is not a squeaky toy. Does this sentence make sense with gun in it? If your answer is no, I absolutely 100% agree with you. So this is semantic encoding, because not only do you need to understand what the word gun means, you also have to understand whether or not it's used appropriately in this sentence. So based on this slide, which one do you think results in the deepest level of encoding or meaning making? Visual, acoustic, or semantic? If your answer is semantic, you're absolutely right. Why? Because you're having to understand what it is you're referring to. On this slide, we're going to talk about declarative memory and procedural or non-declarative memory. Declarative memory are those things that we have the potential to recall, and those include semantic and episodic memories. You can think of semantic memory as book learning or school learning, the kinds of things you would learn in that environment, whether it's facts or language rules like I before E except after C, or learning what birds cannot fly. What's the capital of this particular state? These are things that we typically learn in school or class. Words, definitions, facts, concepts. Episodic memory involves events, especially those things that are personally relevant, personal experiences or episodes. Activities, names, hobbies, your favorite things like a restaurant or activities that you enjoy engaging in. What did you eat for breakfast? What's your favorite restaurant? What did you do on your last birthday? These are all things that would reflect episodic memory. And then there's procedural or non-declarative memory. These are things that we don't have the ability to recall. They can relate to things like motor skills and abilities. For instance, if you play a sport, you can show us the strategies that you use and how you play, but you probably couldn't tell me every single thing that took place to get your skill level to where it is today. Same thing is related to language ability, or your ability to drive, or your ability to walk, or your ability to read. You might not even be able to tell me why you have a certain phobia. Like maybe you're like me and you're afraid of spiders, but you can't tell me every single thing that it took to contribute to your fear the way it is today. So you see a lot of motor skills and abilities, cognitive behaviors and skills, emotional behaviors that get included in procedural or non-declarative memory. Again, we know that those things exist. I know I can drive, but I can't tell you everything that it took to get my driving skills to where they are today. And even though we can't recall everything related to that skill or ability or those feelings, those memories still affect us today and sometimes very powerfully. So if you think about that fear of spiders, I'm not about to go hold a spider or go to a place where there's lots of spiders for me to check out. It's just not going to be my thing. So even though I can't recall why my phobia is what it is, it still affects how I think and feel today. So after going through the different types of memory and various types of encoding, I wanted to bring us back to this slide that we already covered so that we can look at the image on the bottom with greater understanding of how information is processed through each different type of memory. So as mentioned previously, something happens, we take it in through our sensory input, and that goes into sensory memory, either iconic or echoic. If we find that it's important enough for us to focus on and pay attention to, then we encode that information and it goes into working or short-term memory. From there, if we want it to go into long-term memory, then we must encode it, the different types that we talked about, and then it gets stored away long-term. Then we can retrieve it later on for future use if necessary. So let's think of an example here. You're in class or you're listening to an online lecture for a class. So that information is going through your sensory memory. And then the professor says, this is really important for you to know on the exam. Now you focus on this, pay attention, and now that information goes into working memory. So maybe you pause that lecture, or maybe you're in person in a lecture and the professor says, think of a personal example that's connected to this theory. Now you're encoding. Now they're trying to encourage you to engage in elaborative rehearsal. Maybe you're also writing down that term and you're repeating it in your head until you write it down. And then that information goes into long-term memory. Fast forward 2 weeks, you're taking an exam and there's a question related to that information. What you're doing is you're going into long-term memory and pulling it into working or short-term memory to utilize it to help you process and figure out the answer to that question. So you're thinking about that question and you figure out the answer, and then you let the information go and it goes right back into long-term memory without any effort. Have you ever had this happen when you're going to another part of your house to get something and then you go, why am I here? What happens is you're paying attention to all these things, whatever is going on in your environment, and it triggers you to go get something from another room. So that information goes into working or short-term memory. But on your way to getting that item from another room, you get distracted by other things along the way. So what happens is if you don't encode that information into long-term memory, then it's lost after you no longer hold the information into short-term. Same thing happens in sensory information. If you decide that information is not important to know, it won't go into working memory, and so it's lost. If you haven't paid attention to get that information into working memory, it's lost. So the next time you realize you need to get something from another room, just repeat what it is you need to get over and over again in your head till you get to that item. And don't let anyone else distract you along the way. Also looking at this image here, there's an arrow going straight to long-term memory. Those would be examples of automatic processing, the things that get automatically encoded and make their way into long-term memory. And this is the last slide that I'd like for us to talk about with regard to memory. Flashbulb memories are those things that really stand out to you. Maybe it's a very unique event, something like 9/11, if you're old enough to remember when it was happening in real time. Or maybe a car accident, natural disaster, or maybe January 6th. These are things that stand out. And even though we think that we remember everything accurately, a lot of times we have inaccuracy. We might have these details in our head, but those details can be erroneous, and we need to be careful because we can feel very confident that those details are spot on, and then they're actually not. But we're so convinced we remember everything accurately because they're events that are surprising, catch us off guard, or they're significant. Repressed memories. These are things that get pushed into our unconscious. And once it's there, it's hard for us to recall and retrieve it, unless we're using something to help us out like hypnosis or therapy. Then maybe that repressed memory might come out. Or we're exposed to something similar, and then it brings that memory back to the surface. But we can't on our own voluntarily access that memory. Do you believe that exists? Well, we do see in research that it does, especially when we're looking at things that are traumatizing or things that are too painful, that we do have the potential to repress our memories. And then false memories. Studies in psychology show that we can make a suggestion that's false, and it'll get incorporated into someone's memory as if it's actual. And they'll have a vivid recollection of it with detail and make it really believable. They think it's accurate. I mean, if you think about it too, none of us remembers what we were like as babies, but people tell us what we were like, and that becomes our memory of what we were like as babies, even if they might not be accurate, because their memories that they're sharing with us is actually filtered through their own lens, their own perception of how they received us, how they experienced us. There's a video that you'll be watching for our class, if you haven't already done so, that actually shows false memories being implanted. So the thing to keep in mind with regard to memory is they're not always accurate, that we need to stay open to the fact that our memories might not be spot on. And also, sometimes our own filter is what influences what and how we remember something. This concludes the information that I'd like for you to be familiar with regarding memory.